Okay, the moment is upon us. The instance in time in which I sit here recording, and the instance in time in which you have just hit play and are listening, are coinciding, and the space between us has been bridged. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Thank you for being here. Whoever you are you new? If so, welcome. Everyone else, what's up? How was your week? How are we all handling everything? Are we doing okay? If you've been around and you've been listening to the show, I think it's safe to say I've been doing some soul searching, literally and figuratively. And you know, as I was talking about last week, it's partly just about my understanding of yoga, but really not that. It's bigger because my understanding of yoga has to do with the beliefs that I hold, the values that I hold, and wanting to understand where I got to those from. Were those conscious choices by me, or did I fall into them in one way or another? And where did they come from? How did these ideas that are in my head about universal consciousness or higher powers or all these different things we've been talking about on the show, how did I get to these ideas, and where did they come from, like through history, you know? And as I was saying last week, I feel completely overwhelmed in a way when trying to look forward, when I'm trying to look at the way the world is right now and the future my children are growing into. I feel not so empowered always. And I'm looking to feel like I can make better choices. For me, involves looking back sometimes. I want to look back. I want to understand, like I said, how I got to these things and where they came from. And today we have a very rare opportunity to do that. My guest is Dona Holleman. And last week, she was mentioned as well as many other times on the show. She is someone I think who was an important teacher. She planted seeds in a group of people who went on to spread yoga far and wide, including to me. I can kind of trace back influences in my yoga to her, having never met her before. And also, she was alive at a time before things are entirely the way they are now, that she has one, I often talk about how I have 1 foot before the internet and 1 foot after the internet. I feel like I was a bridge generation in terms of coming into this digital world we're in now. Well, I feel like someone like Donna, she was a bridge generation too, from old world to new world or something. So this conversation to me is an important part of the oral history of this show. And it took some doing. It wasn't exactly easy to make happen. So I feel like it was a bit meant to be. I'm so very grateful to have had the chance to connect with Donna and that I get to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I do want to take a quick moment to express gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Today, I specifically want to shout out Nicola Smith and Kelly Ludlow. Thanks, Nicola and Kelly. Really appreciate you. If it wasn't for people like Nicola and Kelly choosing to subscribe to Podcast Premium, frankly, the show wouldn't really be able to keep going. And I said this a few weeks back, and I always hesitate to say this kind of stuff because, I know it's hard right now, and there's a million things that you have to, have a $5 subscription to every month or whatnot. But the truth of the matter is if we look at like how many people listen to this show on a regular, like we can see those numbers, what our regular audience is each week. And we compare that to how many people subscribe to Podcast Premium, that percentage is really low. And it would be cool if we could get a little bit more, like even like 1 more percent, you know, would make a really big deal. Like it wouldn't take that many of you choosing to do that to make a really big difference for me in this show. So if you do listen to this show like regular, and you really appreciate it, maybe now's the moment. And I know you're like, maybe you're driving and you can't do it right now, and it's going to happen like when you get back to your computer, whatever. I get that. But maybe you would hook me up. I would certainly appreciate it. And not only are you helping me out, you do get access to the full archives of this show, which is quite a library. So if you didn't know what the deal is and you don't know what I'm talking about, the most recent 52 episodes of the show are always available and they're full length on the public feed. But we also have a Podcast Premium subscription, and it's the way that you support the show and that you get full access. And if you want to learn more about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, along with finding out about any of my other stuff, or if you want to contact me, everything that I'm doing can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I am going to just leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's get right to it and listen to this conversation that I had with Dona Holleman.
Hello?
Hello, Dona. Can you hear me?
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
The sound is a bit low. Can you put it up or not?
Better now?
Sì, va bene.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm already recording and I would like for us to consider ourselves having just begun, if that's okay with you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, good. Well, Dona, thank you so much for making this time available. I know it took some doing, and I'm very honored and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Uh-huh.
And so what I was going to say to sort of get us started here is that your name has come up on this show many times. And I think the first time I recall someone specifically referencing you was many years ago when Eric Schiffman was on the show. And Eric also talked about having lunch with J. Krishnamurti. And I think he's the only person who's been on the show up until this moment.
You mean Eric Schiffman?
Yes, Eric Schiffman.
Uh-huh.
And he talked about meeting J. Krishnamurti when he was young. And also your names come up many other times. In fact, right now on the show this week is Lolly Stirk. And Lolly told me to send her regards to you. So I want to make sure to do that.
Uh-huh.
And I guess maybe where we can start is your childhood some, because I know that it was in your childhood that you were involved or had some relationship through your family to the Theosophical Society and then ultimately to J. Krishnamurti. So
yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your parents and the Theosophical Society and how you came to stay in the castle in Holland?
Yeah, so the Theosophical Society was a group of people. I think it started with Madame Blavatsky. And they wanted to kind of amalgamate the Hindu philosophy and Western philosophy. So they wanted to bridge India and England in that sense with the philosophy, with the religion. And so the main person, Annie Besant, was involved with that. And they decided, or they thought, that Christ would come back to the earth because the earth needed him. And so he would come back under the name of Maitreya. Maitreya means friend. So he would be the friend of humanity. And so they didn't know who it would be because, of course, the Maitreya would be an angel or something like that. But he needed a human vessel, a human body. So at a certain point, one of the Theosophical Society was walking in Pondicherry on the beach and noticed this little boy, naked, sort of with the feet bare and things like that, very poor boy. But he had an enormous aura around him. So this man thought that that boy would be the Maitreya, would be the vessel for Maitreya. So they took the boy, actually there were two of them, Krishnamurti and Nityananda. They took them and they brought them over to Europe to educate them. Now the name Krishnamurti means the face, Murti, the face of Krishna. Because in India, every 8th boy in a family is called Krishnamurti. Because Krishna, Lord Krishna, was the 8th child in his family. So they took the boys to Paris and England and everywhere to educate them. But at a certain point, Nityananda, the younger one, he got very sick and he died. And Krishnamurti was absolutely devastated. So he locked himself away for a while. And in that time, they say that in that time, the Maitreya came and took him, took his body. So he came out of it, and then he worked for the Theosophical Society, and they organized these meetings called the Star of the East. And he was, of course, the Star of the East. And they had these meetings everywhere in Europe and America, everywhere. And people went all over the world to follow him. And my parents were very much involved in Theosophy first. And then, of course, they were completely carried away by the idea of the Maitreya going and taking Krishnamurti as a vessel. But then the problem was at a certain point that Krishnamurti kind of got tired of all the puspas around him, all the adoration, all the shenanigans, all the whatever, this whole theater around him. And so he decided to split off. And he did that in 1929, I think. And so he made his famous speech, I think it was in California, where he said that he was going to get out of this Theosophy and do his own thing. And people were absolutely devastated because now they had to choose either stay with the old Theosophy or go with Krishnamurti. So my parents decided that they would go with Krishnamurti. So they followed him everywhere. And that went on for a while. But then the Second World War started, to come out. And so everything stopped. Everything was put on hold. And I don't know what happened to Krishnamurti in that time. I don't know where he went in that time. I think the Second World War started in 1942, I think, if I'm not wrong. And so my parents at that moment were in Holland. Now, my father was an officer of the Navy, a naval officer. And so all the men were recruited to go into the war. But because of the Theosophy and because of Krishnamurti, my parents were against the war and against fighting and against all that stuff. So they fled. They went away from Holland and they went to Lebanon and hoping to avoid the war. And so they were deserting. But then the Germans, they went all over Europe and they came to Paris and made the Vichy government in Paris. It meant that also the Lebanon was in war. And so again, my parents fled and they went to Bangkok, to Thailand, hoping that the East would be a safe place to go. But it was a miscalculation, because in the meanwhile, Japan was gearing up for war with China and the whole of the East. So they got to Bangkok, and at that time the war broke out. Japan invaded China, and then they went all over the East. And I don't know if you remember that film, the famous film, The Bridge Over the River Kwai. It was, they made this, they used the river to get down to the south of Europe, of the East. And so, yeah, the Japanese went all over the East, and they also came to Thailand. Now, Thailand was a Buddhist country. And so the Buddhist government said to the Japanese, okay, we don't fight. You can come in, you can do whatever you want, but I don't let you take the Europeans prisoner. We will do it. So the Thai government took all the Europeans into concentration camps. So they were not Japanese camps, but they were Thai camps. And that was a big advantage, because the Japanese camps were incredibly cruel. And they tortured the people and they killed them and they did all kinds of things. But the Buddhist concentration camp of the Thai government was, there was no food and there was no safety, there was no nothing, but there was no torture. So my parents spent, I think, about 4 or 5 years in the concentration camp. And there was nothing there. They were in prison. My brother was about 2 years old then, and I was born there. I was born in the prison camp. And at a certain point, it's really fate, when fate works that way, destiny. So at a certain point, the Americans began to bombard all of Bangkok and also the concentration camp. And so the bombs started falling into the camp. And so the people in the camp, they ran away to the farthest edge of the camp, and there were some buildings there, and they began to dig underneath to hide in kind of underneath the buildings for the bombs, But they did not know that in that building, some people had died of diphtheria. And so as fate goes, destiny goes, my father went into that house and stayed there, and he got the diphtheria and he died. So that's typically destiny. In the meanwhile, the parents, the people in the prison, they were really completely pissed off with the children, which was my brother and me, because I was a screamer and my brother was also a screamer, and so they went bananas with us. So they managed to ask the camp commander to send us away out of the prison. So we went to Hua Hin in a little Catholic nun convent. And we stayed the rest of the war in that convent while my parents stayed in the camp. And so we were in the camp, in the convent, on the beach, and we had a normal life. I mean, we ate and we drank and we slept and we were on the beach, and they rented a pony for me to ride the pony on the beach and things like that. But in the meanwhile, the camp was, of course, very, very bad situation. And because of the diphtheria, my father died. And they couldn't communicate outside the camp. So it was kind of like this through the grapevine that the people in the nunnery heard that my father had died and that my mother was alone. And it was a bit messy, the whole situation. But then the war ended. The war ended because the Americans threw the bomb on Hiroshima. Now, that is a story in itself, because the Japanese had said that if they would lose the war, then all the prisoners of war, all the Western people would be killed, and also all the Japanese officers would be killed. So in order to save the Westerners, America threw the bomb on Hiroshima. And that meant in the eyes of the Japanese that God had told the Japanese emperor that the war was finished because God said so. So he signed the papers of the peace papers. The war was over. And everybody thought that this bomb of the Hiroshima was a meteorite. That's what they thought. And the meteorite was a sign of God that Japan had to stop the war. You understand?
Yes, I do.
So for 3 days, everybody thought that this was a meteorite. And then the Americans threw the bomb on Nagasaki. And that was not right, because the war was over. The emperor had signed and everything was over. So the camps were opened and everybody was looking desperately for their family, for their children, for their parents and everybody. And my mother got the children out of the nunnery and we went back to Holland. That was the only thing she could think of. So we went back to Holland. Now, in the meanwhile, Krishnamurti also was still around and he had made friends with this man, a Baron van Palland, who owned the castle of Eerde, that castle that you talked about. And this castle was used for, at that moment, I think, as a school. So Krishnamurti then asked Philip if he could use the castle to make his annual talks, his talks about, whatever he did.
Yes.
So Philip consented, and so the castle was used by Krishnamurti, and thousands of people went to the annual meetings to meet Krishnamurti at the castle and listen to the talks. So my mother was also a friend of this Philip van Palland. So when we went back to Holland, she wrote to him and asked him if she could come to the castle and teach, because there was a school there. So he said yes. She was a biology teacher. So she went to the castle with the two children and she taught in the castle. At that point, in the castle, there was a Quaker school. Now, I don't know if you know about the Quakers. They were Christian, but without church, without pope, without any rituals. So they were just people, Christian people who believed in Christ. And they used to meet in somebody's house every week. And they used to sit in a circle and just meditate on Christ and on Christianity. And sometimes one would be so immersed in his meditation that he would begin to start to shake with the power of Christ. And so that's why people later on called them the Shakers or the Quakers. And they were completely non-violent people. They had to make an oath that they would never go to war, they would never do any harm to anybody. So they had the school there, and we spent 3 years on the school of the Quakers. My mother taught there, and I went to elementary school, and my brother went to school, and it was fine. But in the meanwhile, my mother herself was born on Java, and Java is in Indonesia, no? Mm-hmm. And she grew up in Java on the plantation, the tea plantation. And she met my father in Java, and they married in Java. And so she felt that Holland was not really her home country. She wanted to go back to Java. And so in 1950, she took the two children and went back to Java. And I remember I was 6, I was almost 7 years old. And at that point in Java, in Indonesia, the war officially was finished. The World War was finished. But there were still some Dutch colonels who did not want to relinquish Indonesia to Indonesia. They wanted to keep Indonesia a colony of Holland. So they were against the Queen of Holland, because the Queen of Holland had signed the paper that Indonesia was no longer a Dutch colony, but was independent. So this colonel, his name was Westerling, and he went on fighting. So we lived in Bandung, and we could hear at night, we could hear still the guns going off and the bombs falling all over the place, and there were military all over the city, and military vehicles, tanks, and everything else. And so we grew up in that kind of atmosphere that, it was war, and we were in the middle of the war. Now, later on, this man had to stop finishing this war because he couldn't keep it up. But in the meanwhile, the children, especially, we had to go to school. So sometimes the soldiers would take us to the school, and sometimes somebody else would take us to the school. And it was very tricky because, there were bombs and they were shooting all the time. So it was kind of strange. But I must say, in all that mess, in all that confusion, the parents of the children, which the Dutch parents, they were incredible because they really managed to raise the children, and that's my mother also, to raise the children in this war scene in a normal way. We went to school, we went to play tennis, we went to the swimming pool. My mother sent me to the horse rider. So this horse rider was another soldier, and he had collected a bunch of old race horses from Australia, and he taught the children to ride horses. And I went bananas. I just went crazy. I was completely horse sick. It was the best thing I could imagine in my life. So we did all those things in spite of the war, in spite of everything. And then also, these children all over the place were kind of, I don't know how to call it, but they were all over the place. And for instance, at one point, my mother got a visit of an Austrian woman who lived in the middle of the jungle. She was a surgeon, and she was doing nothing else but pulling bullets out of people's bodies because there was so much shooting going on. And she had a daughter, and so she asked my mother if her daughter could stay with me in the city, which was more safe. So Iyengar, the daughter, stayed with me for a couple of years, and her mother was in the jungle pulling bullets out of people's bodies. But then, the two of us, we were both 12, 13 years old, we used to go and visit her in the jungle. And I remember she sent the car with the driver, and we had to go, find our way through the various fighting groups of people, to get to the place where she was. So it was really a crazy, crazy time. And in the meanwhile, my mother, she taught biology in the university, and we went for a lot of jungle treks because we had to find flowers and orchids and all kinds of things for the university. And that was it. So she stayed in contact with Theosophy, but of course Krishnamurti was somewhere else. I don't know where he was.
Yeah, excuse me for a second, but you had said earlier that there was like a choice to be made between the Theosophists and Krishnamurti. Did your mom choose one or the other?
Well, no, she chose Krishnamurti, but he was out of the war. He was in America, I think he was, to stay safe, and we were in the middle of the war. So she stayed in contact with the Theosophy. In fact, I got baptized in the Theosophical Church. I was baptized. But then when there was a coup d'etat, what do you call it? A colpo di Stato, what do you call it? When the coup d'etat, what do you call it in English?
coup d'etat, that's what we used. We used the French term, I believe, where the government's overthrown, right?
So the government got overthrown. The Europeans were thrown out of the country, and Sukarno took over, and he killed a lot of people. There was a bloodshed, tremendous bloodshed, and all the white people, all the Europeans, they had to leave from one day to the next. So we had to leave the country. The country was closed, and we had to go back to Holland. So I was 13 by then when I got to Holland. And my mother had to start all over again, finding a new job, finding a house. It was really messy. But in the meanwhile, she again took up contact with Krishnamurti, and I went to school. I went to the classical lyceum, the classical gymnasium, Latin, Greek, and all that stuff. And I began reading Krishnamurti's book when I was about 15, 16. And then when I was about 17, my mother started yoga classes. There was a lady who, I don't know who she was, but there was no yoga in Holland. So she was the only one who did some kind of yoga. The only name which was known in Holland was Indra Devi. I don't know if you know the name. She was also a student of Krishnamacharya. She, Indra Devi, and Iyengar, and Patabi Joyce, and Disikachar, they were pupils of Krishnamacharya. So the only name known was Indra Devi. So I began practicing yoga, and I finished my school. I went to the north of Holland to study Sanskrit in university. I got bored after 2 years, and I said, okay, I want to go and do something else. So in the meanwhile, Krishnamurti had come back to Europe to give his talks, and the first one was in 1960 in a village called Saanen, which is a small village close to Gstaad. Now, Gstaad in Berner Oberland is the place where all the film stars were. Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Peter Sellers, they all had their houses, their chalets in Gstaad. So Krishnamurti did the first talk in Europe after the war in Saanen. And so my mother decided that we would go, she and me, we would go and listen to the talk in Saanen. So we went there, and I was completely taken over by Krishnamurti, and so was she, of course. She knew him. And so afterwards, he went back every year to Saanen, first to Saanen, and later on we had a field between Saanen and Gstaad, where they put up an enormous tent, and each year a couple of thousand people used to go there and listen to Krishnamurti talk and able to ask questions. So by that time I went alone to the talks. I was completely taken in by Krishnamurti, so I went alone, and I stayed in the camping because I had no money whatsoever. And I wanted to know more, so I asked Krishnamurti for private interviews, no? And so he said yes, and so I went to Gstaad, to his house, where he had a house, and the house was rented by Vanda Scaravelli, especially for Krishnamurti. So I used to go there a couple of times a year and talk to Krishnamurti and ask him questions about how to become enlightened, of course, very innocent, how to become enlightened and things like that.
And what did he tell you? What did he say?
He was very kind. He just said, I don't know what he said, but no, he was very helpful, and he was also, he was very encouraging, and he talked about seeing, especially about seeing, that you have to learn to see things as they were and not the way you think they are. The usual stuff they talks about.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that, and then at a certain point, there was another famous man in Gstaad, which was Yehuda Menuhin, and he was a violin player, Hungarian violin player. And he was just the most incredible violin player I've ever heard. And he brought Iyengar to Gstaad because he was doing yoga with Iyengar. So then there were all these men, all these famous men, Yehudi Menuhin and Krishnamurti and Iyengar, and they were all sitting there in Gstaad. And so Krishnamurti also took lessons with Iyengar. And I was the little girl, 20-year-old girl, and I had a beautiful Volkswagen van. So I became kind of like the chauffeur for everybody, driving everybody around in my van. And so I used to drive Iyengar over to Menuhin's house from Chalet Tanek, which is the house of Krishnamurti. I used to bring Iyengar over to Menuhin and back again. And so I was kind of like the taxi service for these guys, for these people. Anyway.
I'm sorry, what was your impression of Iyengar when you were chauffeuring him around?
Okay, so Iyengar, I don't know. I mean, and then in that time, he was not like later on with all these silly clothes and things. He was just dressed normally, but he was Iyengar. Now, I'm sorry to say this, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but my impression always has been that Iyengar was a simple country boy with very little real education, no schooling. So, and on the other hand, also he had still the memory of colonial India, that India was a colony of the West, of England. And I think it still rankled inside him, like a lot of Indians. A lot of Indians were still very angry at having been a colonial for so long. And so, from the beginning, he was very excitable and very, but also very nice, very nice, very, in the beginning, he was really nice and he did a lot of nice things and so, but he and Krishnamurti didn't match, because Krishnamurti was this refined, educated university person, elegantly dressed and very refined, and Iyengar was this boisterous Indian boy. He was about 30 or 35 then, and they just didn't get along. So in the end, Krishnamurti threw him out. He didn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. So he continued with Menuhin, and I continued taking him up and down. But then Iyengar left the house of Vanda, and he went to stay in the village with a very rich lady who offered an apartment to him. So the whole thing kind of fell apart, and I continued with Krishnamurti. I also continued with Iyengar, but then, the whole thing kind of petered out a bit, I think, because also I had no money. I was always camping, and people were helping me here and there with money and things like that, but I couldn't pay. So in the end, the whole thing I stopped going. Krishnamurti was, Vanda, I said, Vanda used to walk with him every day for 2 hours because he needed exercise. He was very frail. And so they went for long walks, for 2-hour walks every day in the hills around Gstaad. And she told me later on that sometimes he used to faint, he used to lose consciousness and fall on the floor. And in that moment, his face used to be completely different. And she told me that she thought that in that moment, the Maitreya, the Christ had taken over his face, his body. So there was still the idea that he was still the vessel of the Maitreya, of the Christ consciousness. So, but that she told me. I don't know if she told anybody else this story. And she was very much in awe of him, and he loved Vanda. Krishnamurti really loved Vanda, and he considered her his kind of system. Also, he was very simple in other ways. He loved cars. Vanda had this absolutely beautiful Jaguar of the 1960s, 50s, 60s. I don't know if you remember them. They were just absolutely beautiful. The Silver Cloud, it was called the Silver Cloud. And he used to drive around in this car like a little boy, as happy as what, and taking the motor apart and showing this car off to everybody. And the other thing, he loved cowboy movies. So every night he used to watch cowboy movies on the television. So he had this very human part of him. And then when he was talking, he was completely transformed. And he was really, let us say, the Maitreya, the teacher, the guru, the consciousness, the Christ consciousness, So he had this double personality, which is very interesting.
Yes. Well, I guess I'm curious. I know you mentioned that you were still studying with Iyengar even after Krishnamurti wasn't interested in him. I know I have some other people on the show who talked about when Desikachar met the Krishnamurtis, both J. Krishnamurti and UG Krishnamurti. But I'm curious. I know you studied with Iyengar for a while. In fact, I read somewhere at some point in London, he referred to you as the European Gita. So I guess I'm curious, what was it like studying with him? Like the yoga that you learned from him? You had mentioned you had done yoga earlier in Holland. How was what he was teaching you different from that?
Yeah, I did yoga in Holland when I was 17, 18. And then I went to university to study. Just after school, when I was 18, I started studying Sanskrit, but I got bored and I wanted to do yoga. So when I was in Gstaad, when I met Iyengar, Krishnamurti kind of asked Iyengar in that point if he would feel like teaching me yoga, And Iyengar was kind of really grumpy and he said, oh, well, blah, 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 And he was pretty rough and really offending. And so if somebody offends me, I get up in my hind legs. So I said, okay, guy, you think you can get me, but you're not getting me. So I told him I was going to come to India, to Bombay. I got a ticket on the Messagerie Maritime, a cargo boat from Marseille to Bombay. And I told Iyengar in August in Gstaad that I was going to India, and in October I was in India. So I studied with him in Bombay first, and he was there the weekend, and he really thrashed me on all sides. I mean, really very tough. But I learned in 9 months, I learned all the asanas, all the postures. I learned everything. The only thing is that he didn't speak English and I didn't speak English, so it was mostly kind of showing and manipulating and helping and things like that. There were 4 of us, three giants and me, 3 giant people and me. And so I got the key of the place where he was teaching, and it was a dance school actually. And I went there in the morning 3 hours and in the afternoon 3 hours practicing by myself. And on the weekend, he used to come and teach. So I spent hours and hours and hours practicing. And on the weekend, he spent hours and hours and hours teaching me. And yeah, that made a big jump in my practice. Then my money finished, so I went back to Europe. I was 23 then, something like that. 23 probably. I went to Holland. I stayed in Holland, and I was staying with my mother, and I did a teacher training course in Holland. And in that course, there was, amongst others, also Victor van Koten was there. Mm-hmm. Victor van Koten, his wife Annemieke, and there were several other people. And I did a 3-year course, teaching course. And then I went back to India, and this time to Pune. So I went back to Pune, and there I stayed in a hotel, and partly I stayed with Iyengar in the house, and partly in the hotel. And again, there were only 3 or 4 of us, very few people. And I spent morning and afternoon. Morning we had classes and I practiced with him 2 by 2. And in the afternoon we did head and shoulder balance, mostly just Iyengar and me, or sometimes with Gita. And so again, I made a huge progress, and he really pushed me through all the postures. And it was very intimate.
Did Iyengar teach you about other things besides postures? Did he teach you about philosophy or text or anything like that, or was mainly just asana?
You mean the philosophy?
I mean, Iyengar, I know you spent time with Krishnamurti, and it seemed like Krishnamurti was mostly focused on like the ideas and concepts more than doing breathing and moving exercises. But I'm curious, in your studies with Iyengar, did he ever emphasize other aspects of yoga, like texts or philosophy, or was it mainly just practice?
Of course, he did. He also used a lot of Sanskrit words. He did a lot of talking about that. But I also, because I had been in the university for 2 years studying Sanskrit, I was very interested in the philosophical part. So I got all the books that I could, Hatha Yoga Paripurga, Shiva Samitra, Yoga Sutras, the Patanjali Sutras, Vedanta, Shankaracharya. I got tons of books, and I was studying. When I was not practicing, I was studying. And he talked a lot about the Sanskrit ideas and Sanskrit. He used a lot of Sanskrit words in the practice also, like Rechika and Purika instead of exhalation, inhalation, and Kumbhaka. And so he used a lot of the Sanskrit words in the practice, which I really enjoy, and I'm doing it now also with my students. I use mostly Sanskrit words in the yoga, in the teaching. So because I think it makes it more authentic. So he did talk, and he talked also about the philosophy, about Shankaracharya, about Advaita Vedanta. And I must say that in my practice, in my thought, in my heart, let's say, I'm a real Advaita Vedantist. I mean, that's where I belong, kind of, which fits in, I think, pretty well with Krishnamurti, that the universe is only one thing. It's not a lot of things. It's only one thing. And we are part of that one thing. So he talked about that a lot. And we did a lot of pranayama, a lot of meditation. And in the meditation, he did a lot of talking about the philosophy and things like that. Yes, sure.
So you think that what Iyengar was teaching, like his interpretations, were in line with Krishnamurti, or did they see things different? Because Krishnamurti, you said, kind of wasn't on board with what Mr. Iyengar was doing.
Iyengar was a conventionalist, how do you call it? Hindu philosophy, Hindu yogic philosophy. Krishnamurti was completely different. He was completely different. So for Krishnamurti, what he said, which actually also Patanjali says, it's the same thing actually, that the problem with us is that in our life, we always have 3 things: the observer, the thing observed, and the act of observation. Those are the 3 things that we deal with. And Patanjali says the same thing, that the 3 things. And so the problem is with that the observer never sees the observed object the way it is, because there's always the interpretation that he does. You know what I mean?
Yes.
I never see a person the way that person really is. I see a person the way I think he is, with all my memories, with all my thoughts, with all my likes and dislikes. So that person, I really don't know, because I only know my image of that person. You follow?
Yes, I do. I do.
So, and that's the big problem of human beings, while animals don't have that problem, because animals don't have those ideas. I mean, one man, very famous horse rider, he said that in front of the horse, the human being is naked. The horse sees the way you are and not the way he wants to see you. So if I see my boyfriend, I want to see that he loves me and he's happy and he's, things like that. Maybe he doesn't, but I don't see it because I hope he does.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit more maybe about Vanda, because she's been we've been talking about her a lot on the show of late as well. So, you mentioned that Vanda was the one who rented the place for Krishnamurti back when, and then at some point, how did you come to know her better?
So Vanda, she was also, I think, a Theosophy in the beginning. She was a countess. She was very, very rich. And Krishnamurti and Iyengar both are always surrounded by rich people. I don't know how that happens. But anyway, she was very rich. And she rented Tanek, the chalet Tanek, she rented it for Krishnamurti. They both lived there. She was downstairs, he was upstairs. And so later on, also Iyengar stayed there. She drove him around. She was there for him all the time. I'm not quite sure how they met, actually. I don't know. And how later it developed.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.